It is the spring of 1944, and somewhere in the English countryside, a Spitfire pilot banks his aircraft low over a cluster of fields on the outskirts of Kent. Below him, an armored division is massing. Hundreds of Sherman tanks sit in perfect formation, their hulls catching the pale morning light. Lorries move between them. Supply dumps swell at the edges of muddy lanes. From 500 feet, it looks like the largest concentration of mechanized force the Allies have yet assembled on British soil. The forward echelon of an entire army, poised to strike across the Channel at the narrowest point between England and occupied France. The pilot completes his pass and banks east. He does not know it, but the formation below him is built entirely from inflatable rubber, painted canvas, and the creative ambition of roughly 1,100 American artists, designers, and engineers who have been handed one of the most extraordinary commissions in the history of warfare. There are no Sherman tanks in those fields. There are no lorries, no supply dumps, no soldiers. There is only the ghost of an army, and it is perhaps the most consequential illusion ever put to canvas. What those artists built, in conditions of absolute secrecy, was not simply a deception. It was the structural scaffolding upon which the Allied victory in Western Europe was hung. Had it failed, had a single German reconnaissance pilot seen through the ruse, had one spy radioed the truth back to Berlin, the largest amphibious invasion in history might have landed against a reinforced wall of Wehrmacht divisions rather than a coast stripped of its defenders. The story of what those artists achieved and how they achieved it remained classified for decades after the war ended. Most of them died before they could speak of it publicly. But the records exist now, and what they reveal is almost impossible to believe. To understand why the deception was necessary, you have to understand the problem the Allies faced in the winter of 1943 and into 1944. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was already decided in principle. The beaches had been chosen. The date was being negotiated. But the sheer scale of the problem was staggering. The Germans held the entire northern French coastline with a defensive network of extraordinary depth. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, and German intelligence, though compromised in many places, remained capable of detecting a large-scale troop build-up on the English coast. The critical question was not whether the Germans knew an invasion was coming. They knew perfectly well it was coming. The question was where, and the answer to that question would determine how many armored divisions they kept concentrated near Calais, at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point, and how many they dispersed toward Normandy. If German High Command believed the main blow would fall at Calais, they would hold their reserves there. If those reserves stayed put in the days immediately following the Normandy landings, the beachhead could be consolidated before the full weight of German armor arrived to push it back into the sea. The Allied deception planners, working under the umbrella operation known as Bodyguard and its sub-plan Fortitude, needed to create the credible impression of a massive, real army group massed in southeast England, directly opposite Calais. They needed this fictitious force to have a name, a commander, an order of battle, radio traffic, vehicle movements, and physical presence on the ground that could be detected by German aerial reconnaissance. They needed, in other words, to build an army from nothing, and they needed to do it fast. The unit assigned to provide the physical component of this deception was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops of the United States Army, which had been quietly assembling since 1943. It would later become known informally as the Ghost Army. Its composition was unlike any military unit before or since. Of its roughly 1,100 personnel, A remarkable proportion were recruited specifically from art schools, design colleges, and the creative industries. The army had placed notices in arts institutions asking for men with skills in illustration, industrial design, set construction, and sound engineering. What arrived was a collection of individuals who, in peacetime, might have been illustrators for advertising agencies, sculptors, theatre technicians, or painters. Several would go on to become significant figures in post-war American art. Their commanding officers sometimes described them as the most talented and eccentric unit in the United States Army. That is probably an understatement. The physical equipment they worked with had been developed through collaboration between the Army and several specialist manufacturers, and it centered on a deceptively simple technology: inflatable rubber decoys. The primary items were inflatable Sherman M4 tanks. Each one, when fully deflated, could be folded into a package roughly the size of a large suitcase and carried by two men. When inflated using a standard air compressor, a process that took between 10 and 15 minutes. It stood approximately 3 meters tall and measured just over 5 meters in length, matching the silhouette of a real Sherman almost exactly when viewed from altitude. The rubber skins were treated with a mixture of paint and a compound designed to create the infrared signature and visual texture of actual steel plate under aerial photography. They also produced inflatable artillery pieces, howitzers and field guns, inflatable landing craft that could be moored in rivers and harbors, and hollow canvas and frame lorries that could be erected in minutes and dismantled just as quickly. Alongside the physical decoys, the unit operated a sound section equipped with state-of-the-art magnetic recording technology. Enormous wire recorders, the best available in 1944, held recordings of tank columns, engineering equipment, and troop movements. These recordings could be broadcast through powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks, audible at distances of more than 20 kilometers, giving the impression of an armored force on the move, when in fact nothing was moving at all. The men of the Ghost Army also operated a specialist radio section that generated entirely fictitious signal traffic. Real military formations produce enormous volumes of radio communication: unit check-ins, supply requests, command traffic, weather reports. The Ghost Army's radio operators had studied the individual transmission styles, known as fists, of specific German-monitored Allied radio operators, and they mimicked them precisely, creating the impression that entire headquarters staffs were moving when they were not. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The deployment of these capabilities in support of Fortitude South, the operation designed to convince the Germans that General George Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group was massed in Kent and Essex, represents one of the most complex pieces of theatrical staging in history. The Ghost Army moved constantly, setting up their inflatable formations near roads and railway lines where German reconnaissance aircraft could observe them, ensuring vehicles left realistic track marks in the ground, and even sending men in correct unit insignia into local towns and public houses to create the impression of a large formation's off-duty presence in the area. The results were almost miraculous. German intelligence assessments throughout the spring of 1944 consistently identified the Pas-de-Calais as the likely primary invasion target. Aerial photographs returned to German analysts in Paris, and Berlin showed what appeared to be massed armored formations in southeast England. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, produced reports estimating Allied strength at figures substantially higher than the reality. Estimates inflated partly by the Ghost Army's work and partly by the network of double agents run by British intelligence, who were feeding false information through channels the Germans trusted. When the landings came on the 6th of June 1944, the Normandy beaches were held not by the full weight of available German armoured reserves, but by a force that had been deliberately kept under strength because Berlin was certain the real blow was still coming at Calais. Crucially, even after the landings, Hitler and much of German high command remained convinced for weeks that Normandy was a feint, a preliminary attack designed to draw reserves south before the real invasion hit the Pas de Calais. The 15th Army, Germany's largest and best equipped formation in France, sat largely immobile near Calais for nearly 2 months after D-Day, waiting for a second invasion that never came. Those 2 months gave the Allies time to consolidate their beachhead, build up their strength, and begin the breakout that would eventually drive Germany from France entirely. It is worth considering what the German equivalents looked like by comparison, because the contrast is instructive. Germany had its own deception units, and it had developed its own inflatable decoys, principally for use in hiding real tank formations from Allied air attack rather than creating false ones. German inflatable panzers were used to draw Allied fighter-bomber attacks away from real armor, with some success. But German strategic deception never achieved anything approaching the systemic, coordinated ambition of fortitude. Part of this was structural. Hitler's command style did not encourage the kind of long-range, imaginative planning that deception operations require. Part of it was resource. By 1944, Germany simply did not have the surplus capacity in materials, personnel, or bandwidth to mount large-scale deceptions when its military was fighting desperately on 3 fronts simultaneously. The Americans and British had devoted serious institutional thought to deception as a component of strategy since 1941. The London Controlling Section, a British body responsible for coordinating Allied strategic deception, had built up years of experience and a sophisticated doctrine by the time fortitude was planned. The Ghost Army was the physical expression of that doctrine at its most inventive. No other power in the war produced anything quite like it. The true impact of the Ghost Army's work is, in some respects, impossible to calculate precisely, because deception operations work by preventing things from happening, and you cannot measure the weight of disasters that were avoided. What historians can say is that the German decision to hold armoured reserves near Calais during the critical weeks after D-Day cost them any realistic chance of defeating the Allied landings in the period when the beachhead was most vulnerable. The deception contributed materially to that decision. How much of the credit belongs to the Ghost Army specifically? How much to the double agents? How much to the signal deceptions and the fictitious order of battle? That is a question the records do not answer neatly. But the consensus among historians of the European campaign is that fortitude, taken as a whole, was probably the most consequential strategic deception operation of the entire war. Very few of the men involved spoke about what they had done for many years after 1945. The operation remained classified until 1996. Several of the Ghost Army's most prominent alumni, among them the fashion designer Bill Blass, who served as a staff sergeant, and the artist Ellsworth Kelly, returned to civilian life and pursued extraordinary careers without ever being able to explain the strange interlude of their war service to family or colleagues. It was only in the 1990s and 2000s, as the records were gradually declassified and veterans were finally permitted to speak, that the full shape of the Ghost Army story became clear. A documentary film released in 2013 introduced many viewers to the unit for the first time. In 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army surviving veterans the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors the country can bestow, acknowledging, more than 75 years after the fact, what those artists had done. Some of the physical equipment survives. Inflatable Sherman tanks can be seen in museums, including at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where one has been restored to something approximating its wartime appearance. They are, up close, oddly moving objects. Not much to look at. Clearly artificial, smelling faintly of old rubber. It takes a particular act of imagination to see in them what German reconnaissance pilots saw from 500 feet in the spring of 1944. A massed armoured division poised to strike. Return, then, to that Kentish field. The Spitfire pilot banks away and climbs back toward the grey English sky. Below him, the formation sits motionless in the morning light. Hundreds of rubber shapes, meticulously positioned, track marks pressed carefully into the mud by men who understood that reality, at altitude, is largely a matter of shadow and suggestion. The pilot does not know it is false. The German analyst who will study his photographs does not know it is false. And because they do not know, the real army, the real men, the real tanks, the real ships loading in ports along the south coast can move without detection toward the beaches that will decide the war. 1,100 artists went to war. They carried no conventional weapons of consequence. They built their arsenal from rubber, canvas, paint, and sound. And with it, they deceived an entire army, held a reserve force of tens of thousands of German soldiers in the wrong place at the decisive moment, and helped to make the liberation of Western Europe possible. The tanks were fake. The outcome was not.